At 90 meters deep at the bottom of the Black Sea, there are houses. In 2000, the man who found the Titanic, Robert Ballard, lowered underwater cameras near Sinop, Turkey. He found worked wooden beams, stone tools, intact rectangular structures, over 7,000 years old, and below them, a layer of broken shells, the geological sign of an entire lake dying all at once. Geologists from Colombia calculated 42 cubic kilometers of salt water poured in per day, 200 times the Niagara Falls, for more than 300 consecutive days. The people living there had less than 24 hours to escape before the water swallowed everything. But the most disturbing detail about what they found on that bottom has not yet been revealed to the public. But before understanding what was destroyed, you need to know what existed there. Because the story that most people do not know, and that completely changes the way we see this sea floor, begins not with water, but with land. Around 6000 BC, the plain north of the Bosporus was one of the most habitable places on the planet. The climate had warmed in the last 4,000 years, since the peak of the last glaciation. The rivers flowing down from the European mountains fed a vast, calm, freshwater lake surrounded by fertile land. The southern shore of this lake was where the northern coast of Turkey is today. The northern shore was where Ukraine is today. And in the middle, a flat, humid, naturally irrigated plain, the size of the state of Florida in the United States. It was not empty land. Archaeologists who worked in the lower Danube region and the Black Sea steppes, especially teams from Romania, Bulgaria and Ukraine in the 1980s and 90s, identified late Neolithic settlements with dates that converge exactly to this period. They were sedentary communities. They planted emmer wheat and barley. They raised domesticated sheep, goats and cattle. They built rectangular structures of wood and clay, with walls of interwoven branches filled with mud, a technique called wattle and daub that appears in practically all Neolithic cultures of Europe and the Near East at the same time, between 6000 and 5000 BC. They were not nomads. They were not hunters passing through the territory. They were people with a fixed address. And this matters more than it seems. When a sedentary community is destroyed, it leaves behind things that a nomadic community never would. Permanent structures, stockpiled tools, stored seeds, pottery, animal bones, hearth ashes. The archaeological record of a sedentary village is dense, concrete and datable. The record of a shipwrecked village at 90 meters deep in oxygen-free waters is potentially perfect. Stop. Think about that for a moment. Each wooden beam found by Ballard represents not just a construction, it represents a human decision, someone who cut down a tree, working the wood with stone tools, fitted the pieces together and built a roof under which they slept, raised children, stored food for the winter. 7,000 years before Christ, humanity had no writing, it had no metal, but it had architecture, it had neighbors, it had the psychological permanence of someone who knows they are going home tomorrow. The culture that archaeologists identify in this region in this period belongs to what is called the Cucuteni Tripilia cultural complex, which flourished between approximately 5,500 and 2,700 BC in the regions that today correspond to Romania, Moldova, and western Ukraine. They were peoples who produced some of the most elaborate pottery of the prehistoric world, spirals and geometric patterns painted in red, black, and white. Some of the Cucuteni Tripilia villages had up to 15,000 inhabitants, which would make them, by definition, cities, not villages. Researchers from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine documented in the 2010s and 20 structures that indicate urban planning with clearly demarcated streets and community use areas. And the southern shore of the lake, the region directly submerged by the flood, was adjacent to this world. But the submerged plain was not inhabited only by these northern peoples. On the other side, in Anatolia, the territory that is today Turkey, the descendants of the same Neolithic traditions that built Çatalhöyük had spread toward the coast. Çatalhöyük, first excavated by British archaeologist James Mellart in the 1950s and then revisited by Ian Hodder of Stanford University for decades, was one of the first cities in human history with up to 8,000 inhabitants, occupied between approximately 7,500 and 5,700 BC. When the flood happened, Çatalhöyük had already been inhabited for almost 2,000 years. The people of Anatolia, who lived near the southern shore of the lake, had known this territory for generations. Here is where the story gets disturbing. The period in which the flood occurred, around 5,600 BC, coincides with an archaeological rupture documented in multiple regions at the same time. Settlements that had existed for centuries are abruptly abandoned. New communities appear suddenly in distant regions, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Balkans, in the Indus Plains. Archaeologists call this phenomenon the Neolithic dispersal. For decades, no one could explain the trigger. Ryan and Pitman, in publishing their hypothesis, proposed an explanation for the first time based on physical evidence. The trigger was the water. The trigger was the Black Sea. And now comes the question that Ryan and Pitman asked themselves when they analyzed the sediment cores taken from the bottom. How long did the breach last? How much time did these people have to get out? The answer is found not in the structures that Ballard filmed, but in the geology of the only point that separates two worlds. The strip of land that held the ocean for millennia and that, at a certain moment, simply could not take it anymore. The Bosporus. And what happened there is more violent than any documentary has ever shown. The Bosporus is today between 300 and 800 meters wide. In some stretches, you can see the other side with the naked eye. It is a narrow, deep channel with a strong current. One of the busiest maritime passages on the planet, with more than 45,000 ships crossing per year. Istanbul was built exactly there because whoever controlled that strip of water controlled the trade between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But in 6000 BC, the Bosphorus did not exist. In place of the channel, there was a ridge of sedimentary rock, fragmented limestone, compacted sand, layers of sediment deposited during millennia while the global sea level rose and fell. Walter Pitman, in analyzing the geological samples taken from the channel floor in the following decades, described the composition of that barrier with a word that was recorded in scientific literature: trashy, brittle, fragmented. It was not solid granite. It was the type of rock that gives way when pressure increases. And the pressure had been increasing for millennia. Since the end of the last great glaciation, around 18,000 years ago, the global ocean level had been rising gradually as the glaciers melted. The process was not dramatic day to day. It was imperceptible to anyone living at that time. But it was relentless. Every century, the Mediterranean rose a few meters. Every millennium, the distance between the sea surface and the top of the Bosphorus barrier decreased. On the other side, the freshwater lake was shrinking. This is fundamental to understanding the mechanics of what happened. The Mediterranean was rising, the Black Sea lake was falling, because its tributaries had changed course toward the Atlantic and the Baltic. This means that at the time of the breach, there was a difference in level between the two bodies of water. Ryan and Pitman's estimates, based on sediment analysis and hydrological modeling, published in the journal Marine Geology in 1998, point to a difference of approximately 150 meters between the level of the Mediterranean and the level of the lake. 150 meters of hydrostatic pressure difference. Now think about what that means physically. You have an ocean on one side, a lake on the other, and between them a ridge of brittle rock that by geological chance was being eroded from below by the infiltration of salt water through the fissures. Ryan described the process as regressive erosion. The water penetrating through the cracks in the rock dissolved the limestone sediments, widened the fissures, allowed more infiltration, dissolved more rock. A cycle that accelerated itself until the moment when the top of the barrier gave way. And here is where the numbers stop being abstract and become something you can feel. When the barrier broke, the level difference between the two bodies of water created a gravitational cascade. The water of the Mediterranean did not flow through the Bosporus. It plummeted. Ryan and Pitman's hydrological models calculated the flow at 42 cubic kilometers per day, a number that most people read and cannot visualize. But there is a comparison that makes this number concrete. Niagara Falls pours out, on average, just under 2/10 of a cubic kilometer of water per day. The Bosporus cascade was 200 times larger than Niagara per day. For at least 300 consecutive days, this was not a flood. This was a geological cut. The force of this flow, concentrated in a narrow passage, excavated the rocky floor of the Bosporus with a speed that geologists did not expect to find. Later bathymetric studies, measurements of the channel bottom, revealed erosion marks more than 90 meters deep in the rock of the Bosporus bed. This is not the slow erosion of millennia. It is the type of mark that high-velocity water carries with cutting force over rock. The same process that creates canyons, done in weeks. Stop. Think about that for a moment. The canyon we today call the Bosporus was not created by continental drift. It was not sculpted by millions of years of gradual erosion. It was ripped open in a matter of weeks by a cascade of salt water. And at the same time, the channel deepened, the ocean boundary advanced over the plain on the other side at the speed of approximately 1 kilometer and 600 meters per day. What Ryan and Pitman's sediment cores show, layer by layer, is the physical record of this moment. At the base, freshwater mud, deposited by thousands of years of the lake's calm existence. Then, an abrupt layer of crushed freshwater mollusk shell fragments, the shell hash, the sign of sudden mass death of an entire fauna that did not survive the salinization. And above, fine sediment loaded with marine species. The transition between the two layers is thin as a sheet of paper. There are no intermediate layers, no gradual adaptation. It is a cut. The scientific controversy that arose afterward, and it exists, and it matters, and we will get to it, is not about whether the flood happened. It is about the speed, about the degree of catastrophism, about whether the people who lived there had days, weeks, or months to react. And the answer to that question changes everything about how you interpret what Ballard found on the sea floor. Because if the water advanced 1 kilometer and 600 meters per day, as Ryan and Pitman calculated, then a person who woke up in the morning with the waterline 20 kilometers from their village had less than 2 weeks before seeing their house submerged. There was no time to dismantle it, no time to take everything. There was time to run. And that is exactly what the bottom of the Black Sea seems to show. But what Ballard found in 2000 was not just old wood. It was something that forced Columbia University to issue an official statement, something that Dr. Ryan described publicly as a stunning confirmation, and something that, for reasons that have not yet become entirely clear, never became the front-page headline it should have been. Let's stop here for a moment and do something that scientific articles never do. Let's transform the numbers into human experience. Because 42 cubic kilometers of water per day is a measurement. It is a unit of volume divided by a unit of time. It is the kind of data that appears in tables of academic journals and that most people read, process as very large, and forget in 10 seconds. But when you translate that number to ground level, to the height of a person's knees, to the speed with which the water touches a child's feet, what you find is different. It is the portrait of a catastrophe without parallel in recorded human history. 1 kilometer and 600 meters per day. That is the horizontal advance of the water boundary over the plain. It seems small. In speed, it is less than 2 meters per hour. You walk faster than that. But the issue is not the speed at which the water advances. The issue is that it does not stop. Never. Neither day nor night. Neither during storms nor during calms. Every 24 hours, another 1 kilometer and 600 meters of dry land becomes seafloor. Forever. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing that the horizon to the south has changed. The line that yesterday was dry land today has a different reflection. Something that shines where it should not shine. You do not understand what you are seeing. Your neighbors do not understand. No person alive at that time had ever seen the sea. They lived in a freshwater lake. They knew seasonal floods. The Danube rose. The nearby plains flooded. The water receded. This was different. The water that arrived at that moment did not recede. By the third day, the waterline was almost 5 kilometers closer than it was on the morning you noticed the problem. By the 10th day, it was 16 kilometers closer. Your village, if it were 30 kilometers from the original shore of the lake, had less than 3 weeks before being swallowed. But the issue was not just the distance, it was the height. The terrain was not perfectly flat. There were depressions, low valleys, corridors through which the water advanced faster than average. There were mornings when the advance was 2 kilometers. There were nights when the water covered entire plains in a few hours because the ground ahead was lower than the ground behind. And here is the detail that Walter Pitman recorded, and that rarely appears in news reports on this subject. The animals noticed before the humans. The cattle, the sheep, the goats, the domesticated animals that grazed on the low plains began to move toward the hills days before the water arrived. Not because they had a rational awareness of what was happening, but because the damp soil under their hooves, the different smell of the air, the increasing humidity that seeped into the earth days before the visible water, all of this activated instincts that sedentary humans, confident in the permanence of their territory, perhaps took longer to recognize. Animal behavior researchers who studied historical flood events documented this pattern repeatedly. Humans wait. They observe. They consult the elders. They try to understand if it is temporary. This hesitation, multiplied by the scale of the Black Sea flood, may have cost lives, but the numbers of the total scale are even more devastating than the daily advance. In 300 days of continuous flooding, the minimum period calculated by Ryan and Pitman for the Black Sea level to rise enough to balance with the Mediterranean. The total area submerged corresponded to approximately 100,000 square kilometers. To have a concrete reference, the state of Florida has 170,000 square kilometers, 2/3 of Florida, submerged in less than a year. Can you imagine that? An entire civilization wiped off the map in less time than a pregnancy lasts. The final depth is also revealing. The structures that Ballard found are at 95 meters below the current surface. This means that the Black Sea level rose almost 100 meters relative to the level it had when those houses were built. Every meter of rise represented more submerged land, more covered villages, more escape routes cut off by water advancing from multiple directions at the same time, because the plain did not have only one border with the lake. It had coasts to the south, the east, the west. Water came from all sides. And here is where the story gets disturbing in a different way. 42 cubic kilometers per day is Ryan and Pitman's estimate. But other researchers, including geologist Valentina Janko-Hombach, who organized a review of 35 international studies published in 2007, argue that the event may have been more gradual. Not a catastrophic breach of hours, but a process that stretched over centuries of slow and steady sea level rise with periodic accelerations. If Janko-Hombach is right, the people living on the plain would have had much more time to notice and react. But the sedimentary record says something else. The shell hash layer, the crushed shells that Ryan and Pitman found in the cores, does not show a smooth transition. It shows an abrupt cut. The freshwater fauna died too fast to leave a record of adaptation. This does not fit with centuries of gradual rise. It fits with a violent and rapid salinization, the type that happens when 42 cubic kilometers of salt water enter per day into a lake that has no outlet. And there is still a third piece of data that closes this argument in a way that is hard to dispute. The Bosporus Channel. The erosion depth in the channel floor, more than 90 meters of rock excavated below the original base of the barrier, is physically incompatible with gradual erosion over centuries. Gradual erosion produces smooth profiles, sloped walls, uniform wear marks. What geologists found in the Bosporus bed are marks of violent cutting, the type of profile that high-velocity water under extreme hydrostatic pressure produces in a very short time. The rock does not lie, but the question that remains hanging in the air, the question that Robert Ballard went to answer in 2000 aboard the ship Northern Horizon with underwater cameras and unmanned vehicles, was not about the geology of the Bosporus. It was about the other side. It was about what was left behind when the water came. It was about the people. And what he found at 95 meters deep, 12 miles from the Turkish coast, was not just proof of Ryan and Pitman's theory. It was something that neither of the two scientists was expecting to see with that level of detail. Since September of the year 2000, Robert Ballard was 58 years old and had already found more things on the seafloor than any other living human being. The Titanic in 1985, the Bismarck in 1989, the aircraft carrier Yorktown sunk in the Battle of Midway in 1998. Ballard was not just a diver with expensive equipment. He was the architect of an entire methodology of deep-sea exploration. The development of unmanned underwater vehicles, the ROVs, which allowed filming and collecting samples at depths where no human could survive. He understood the sea floor the way a surgeon understands the interior of the human body, as a space with its own logic, with layers, with stories written in sediment and rust. When William Ryan approached him with the Black Sea hypothesis, Ballard immediately recognized what was at stake. If Ryan and Pitman were right, if the submerged plain had been inhabited by Neolithic communities before the flood, then the bottom of the Black Sea held something that no land excavation could ever offer, an intact archaeological site, preserved in oxygen-free waters, frozen at the exact moment it was abandoned. It was not theory, it was a testable prediction, and Ballard was the only man in the world with the instruments to test it. The expedition was funded by the National Geographic Society and by Columbia University. The ship chosen was the Northern Horizon. The destination, the northern coast of Turkey, near the port city of Sinop, one of the regions where Ryan's models indicated the highest probability of finding traces of the inhabited plain before the flood. The choice of Sinop was not random. The bathymetry of the region, the mapping of the relief of the sea floor, showed a relatively shallow underwater shelf that extended from the Turkish coast to the north before plunging into greater depths. It was exactly the type of terrain that, before the flood, would have been a flat and habitable coastal strip on the shores of the freshwater lake. If there were villages in that plain, the remains would be on that shelf at a depth of 90 to 100 meters, within the operational range of Ballard's ROVs. On the morning of September 12, 2000, the underwater vehicles went down. What the cameras transmitted to the ship was initially what was expected: mud. Fine, dark sediment deposited in layers over millennia. No natural light reached this depth. The ROVs illuminated the way with their own spotlights, creating a cone of white light in an environment of absolute darkness. Visibility was a few meters ahead. The bottom moved slowly across the monitor screens of the Northern Horizon as the team watched in silence, and then it appeared. Less than 12 miles from the Turkish coast, at 95 meters deep, the cameras found a rectangular structure. Not a rock formation, not a geological accident. A structure with right angles, with worked wooden beams in positions that do not occur naturally, with what were clearly interwoven branches forming walls. Around the structure, flaked stone tools, pottery fragments, and scattered through the sediment around, in a layer that covered the entire area, fossilized freshwater mollusks. Columbia University issued the official statement on September 13, 2000. Dr. Ryan publicly declared, "This is a stunning confirmation of our thesis. The carbon-14 dating of the freshwater mollusk fossils found at the same stratigraphic level as the structures indicated an age greater than 7,000 years, which placed the site directly in the period prior to the flood calculated by Ryan and Pitman. Here is where the story gets disturbing. The discovery was reported. The New York Times covered it. National Geographic published it. Ballard gave interviews, and then silence. The world moved on. No systematic excavation was carried out at the site in the following years. No museum built a permanent exhibition around the find. No government program funded a return expedition to map the full extent of what was there. Why? The answer has several layers. The first is logistics. Excavating submerged archaeology at 95 meters deep is technically extraordinary and financially prohibitive. There is no shovel that reaches that far. Every minute of operation of a precision archaeological ROV at depth is equivalent to an amount that drains research budgets quickly. The second reason is political. The coast belongs to Turkey, and any submerged excavation in Turkish territorial waters requires diplomatic negotiations, licenses, and the supervision of the Turkish government, a process that can take years. But there is a third reason, less discussed and more uncomfortable. Ballard's discovery was not conclusive enough to close the debate. The structures were there, the dating was correct, but the sampling was small. A few square meters of mud mapped, not a systematic excavation. Critics of Ryan and Pitman pointed out that wooden structures can be moved by underwater currents over millennia, that the dating of the mollusks around the structures does not prove that the mollusks and the structures are contemporary, that it would be necessary to find artifacts in situ, in the exact original context of use, without disturbance, to have scientific certainty. And Ballard had not done that. He had found something extraordinary, but science demands more than extraordinary. Stop. Think about that for a moment. The man who found the Titanic, a 52,000-ton ship sunk in the North Atlantic at 3,800 meters deep after decades of failed searches, found human structures of 7,000 years old at 95 meters deep in the Black Sea in a single expedition of days. And the scientific world said, "Interesting, but we need more proof." The expedition was the subject of publication in the American Journal of Archaeology, in volume 105, number 4 of 2001. The article, signed by Ballard and the team from the Institute for Exploration in partnership with researchers from Lund University in Sweden, methodically documented what was found and what still needed to be investigated. It was rigorous, it was cautious, it was scientific, and it remained largely ignored by the public for more than a decade. What most people do not know, and what completely changes the weight of that discovery, is that Ballard found not one structure, but evidence of multiple points of human occupation in the same area. The extent of what could be under that sediment was impossible to calculate with the instruments available in 2000. But there was something at the bottom of the Black Sea that should not have been there by the scientific consensus prior to Ryan and Pitman's hypothesis. There were houses, and under the houses, preserved in perfection by a natural system that has no parallel anywhere else on the planet, there was something that went beyond what any archaeologist had ever considered possible to find. Most of the planet's seas are alive all the way to the bottom. Underwater currents move oxygenated water from the surface layers to the depths. Decomposing organisms, bacteria, fungi, worms, crustaceans, work at all levels, consuming any organic material that sinks: wood, bone, fabric, leather. That is why ships wrecked in open oceans disappear in centuries. The iron hull rusts. The wood is devoured by shipworms, boring mollusks that excavate tunnels in any submerged woody surface. In shallow tropical waters, a wooden ship can be completely consumed in less than 100 years. The Black Sea does not work like that. Below approximately 150 meters deep, the Black Sea is anoxic, oxygen-free, completely, not partially, not seasonally, permanently. It is one of the largest anoxic water masses on the planet, and it exists for a reason directly linked to the flood. When the salt water of the Mediterranean entered through the Bosporus in large volume, it sank. Because salt water is denser than fresh water, the dense salt water settled at the bottom of the Black Sea and stayed there without circulating, without mixing with the surface layers of lighter water. Over time, bacterial activity consumed all the dissolved oxygen in this lower layer. And with no oxygen to replace it, the layer remained permanently dead. Dead for decomposing organisms, but perfect for preservation. Anything that sinks below 150 meters in the Black Sea enters a chamber where time, in terms of organic decomposition, practically stops. There is no oxygen to sustain the bacteria that devour wood. There are no shipworms. There are no decomposing crustaceans. There is fine mud, absolute darkness, pressure of dozens of atmospheres, and silence, and it is exactly this chamber that preserved the structures found by Ballard. But the most dramatic proof of what this anoxia is capable of preserving did not come from the 2000 expedition. It came 18 years later from a completely different team working on a much larger scale project. Between 2015 and 2018, the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, the Black Sea Map, funded by the ERC Center of the University of Southampton and led by Professor John Adams, carried out the most systematic underwater scanning ever done in the Black Sea. Using vessels equipped with side-scan sonar and autonomous mapping vehicles, the team catalogued 65 shipwreck sites in deep water. They were not all ancient. Some were 20th century ships. But the chronological diversity of what they found was extraordinary. Roman, medieval, Ottoman, Byzantine vessels, all preserved to degrees that do not exist in any other body of water in the world. And then, in October 2018, the team announced the discovery that made the world stop for a few days. At 12.5 meters long, with the mast still standing vertically, the sail folded over the transverse yard, the oars in their original supports, the cargo hatch closed, a Greek merchant ship intact, resting on the bottom of the Black Sea at more than 2,000 meters deep. The carbon-14 dating, carried out by laboratories at the University of Southampton and the University of Edinburgh from wood samples taken from the hull, indicated an age of 2,400 years. 2,400 years, intact. Professor Adams, in announcing the discovery at a conference in Athens, described the ship as a truly epic find. The BBC covered it on the front page of the website. The Guardian newspaper published the ROV images that showed the vertical mast, the oars in place, the wood dark but structurally sound after 24 centuries on the sea floor. The ship was named Sinop D ship in the formal project records, a reference to the region where it was found. Here is what that means for what Ballard found. If a 2,400-year-old wooden ship is intact, with mast, sail and oars, in those waters, then the wooden structures that Ballard filmed at 95 meters deep, with 7,000 years of age, can be preserved in a state that defies any intuition about what time does to organic materials. The beams that the 2000 cameras filmed may still have today the texture of worked wood. The original curvature of the interwoven branches in the walls may still be legible. The stone tools around may still be exactly where the last person who used them left them when they ran out. Stop. Think about that for a moment. 7,000 years, and the object may be more preserved than artifacts excavated at land sites with 200 years of age. The Black Sea map catalogued 65 shipwrecks. But shipwrecks are discrete objects, a hull here, an anchor there. What exists below the Sinop underwater shelf is not a shipwreck. It is potentially a human occupation site of undetermined area. The Ballard expedition mapped a few square meters. No one knows how many square kilometers of village, tools, pottery, bones and structures are under that sediment. The Black Sea map, with all its technological reach, focused on shipwrecks, not on archaeology of the floor surface. And here is the paradox that Professor Adams mentioned in an interview with the University of Southampton after the discovery of the Greek ship. The same catastrophe that destroyed the communities living on the plain created the conditions that preserved the remains of those communities. The flood that killed the freshwater lake by depositing dense salt water at the bottom and creating the permanent anoxic zone transformed the bottom of the Black Sea into the largest and best natural museum in human history. No flood, no anoxia. No anoxia, no preservation. The event that erased a civilization may have kept the proofs of that civilization better than any human vault ever could. But there is something else on that bottom that has not yet been mentioned. The 65 shipwrecks of the Black Sea map were found in deep water, below 150 meters in the anoxic zone. But the Sinop underwater shelf, where Ballard worked, is between 80 and 100 meters deep, in a transition zone, close to but not identical to the deep anoxic zone. This raises a technical question that archaeologists have not yet answered clearly. What exactly is the state of preservation of the structures at this specific depth? Is the anoxia complete there, or partial? The answer matters because it determines whether what is buried under the Sinop sediment still exists, or if it was slowly consumed in the 70 decades of centuries since it was abandoned. And the only way to know is to go down and excavate. No one has done that yet. Not systematically, not with the instruments that exist today, and that did not exist in 2000 when Ballard first went. And while that excavation does not happen, what rests at the bottom of the Black Sea remains in a state of suspension that is at once scientific and almost biblical, preserved but inaccessible, visible but untouchable, real but not yet completely proven. What we know for sure is that the water arrived, that the people fled, that some survived, and that the survivors went far enough to change the world. Science does not work by immediate consensus. It works by friction, by challenge, by groups of researchers who take the data of other groups, test the same data with different methods, reach different conclusions, and publish those conclusions in peer-reviewed journals where other researchers read, challenge, and refine again. It is a slow, uncomfortable, and often misunderstood process by the public, which tends to interpret scientific disagreement as a sign that nobody knows anything, when in fact it is exactly the opposite. It is the sign that the subject is serious enough that multiple elite groups are dedicating resources to it. Ryan and Pitman's hypothesis went through this process, and what emerged from the friction was not the destruction of the hypothesis. It was the refinement of it. The first serious challenge came from Teofilo Abrajano Jr., an oceanographer at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York, who in 2002 published an analysis of sediments from the Sea of Marmara, the small sea between the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. What Abrajano found in the Sea of Marmara was a sequence of deposits that indicated continuous interaction between the waters of the Mediterranean and those of the Black Sea for at least 10,000 years, long before the breach date proposed by Ryan and Pitman. The implication was direct. If there was continuous interaction, perhaps there was not a singular catastrophic breach. Perhaps the process was much more gradual than Ryan and Pitman calculated. The Rensselaer University newspaper reported Abrajano's research with a direct headline: "Noah's flood hypothesis may not hold up. Science magazine published coverage of the debate in June 2002. The scientific world paid attention, but Ryan responded. The Sea of Marmara deposits that Abbracciano identified were real, but Ryan argued that they recorded minor and periodic seepages through the fissures of the Bosporus, not a continuous and stable flow. The difference was like comparing leaks in a dike with the breaking of the dike. The leaks existed, but that did not prevent the dike from breaking catastrophically at a certain moment when the pressure exceeded the structural threshold of the rock. The second challenge came from a source harder to ignore. Valentina Janko-Hombach was a geology professor at Odessa University and one of the world's leading experts on Black Sea paleogeography. The study of how the geography of that sea changed over geological time. In 2007, she organized and edited a monumental collection, The Black Sea Flood Question, Changes in Coastline, Climate and Human Settlement, published by Springer, with 35 studies from researchers in 12 different countries. It was the most comprehensive review of the topic ever conducted. Janko-Hombach's conclusion was not that Ryan and Pitman were wrong about the flood, it was that they were wrong about the speed. The data that she and her collaborators presented, based on analysis of fossil pollen, marine microfossils, oxygen isotopes in shells, and stratigraphy from multiple sites around the Black Sea, pointed to a transition from freshwater to saltwater that occurred over centuries, not months. The rise in the Black Sea level had been real but progressive. Not a cascade of 42 cubic kilometers per day, but a slower process of increasing infiltration that eventually flooded the plain. Yes, but giving the populations living there enough time to migrate in an orderly fashion. This changed everything in terms of human experience. If Janko-Hombach is right, there was no desperate flight at dawn, no villages swallowed before people could react. There were decades, perhaps centuries, of gradual rise in the lake level, with communities progressively moving to higher grounds, taking their traditions, their animals, their seeds, their cultural memory. But here comes the problem with the gradualist hypothesis. And it is a physical problem, not an interpretive one, the shell hash. The layer of crushed shells that Ryan and Pitman identified in the sediment cores, the mark of the mass death of the freshwater fauna, is too thin to represent centuries of gradual transition. In a slow transition, freshwater species would die off progressively as salinity increased. The sedimentary record would show a mixture of fresh and saltwater species in overlapping layers over a considerable depth of sediment. This is not what the cores show. The cores show a line, an abrupt cut. Below, fresh water. Above, salt water. Between the two, a layer of destruction that does not have sufficient thickness to represent centuries. Geologist Mark Siddall from the University of Bristol published in 2004 in the journal Nature a modeling of the Black Sea flood dynamics, based on analysis of strontium isotopes in shells, a geochemical proxy that records water salinity at the moment the shell formed. Siddall's results supported a rapid flood event, not necessarily in Ryan and Pitman's extreme terms, but clearly closer to the catastrophic than to the gradual. And here is where the story gets disturbing in a way that is rarely discussed publicly. The debate between catastrophism and gradualism in the Black Sea is not just a technical dispute over sedimentation speed. It is a dispute over what happened to the people. If the event was catastrophic, it was traumatic enough to generate collective memory transmitted for millennia. The type of memory that survives in oral narratives, in founding myths, in sacred texts. If it was gradual, it was just a slow migration, no different from hundreds of other migrations that humanity made throughout prehistory without leaving a lasting cultural scar. The difference between the two hypotheses is, literally, the difference between an event that generates a sacred book and an event that generates a footnote in regional archaeology. Ryan and Pitman, in the 1998 book, did not hesitate to make this connection. The book's subtitle was direct: The New Scientific Discoveries About the Event That Changed History. They argued that the diaspora caused by the flood spread Neolithic populations to regions that had never before received mass sedentary farmers, and that this dispersal was the trigger for the civilizational acceleration that produced Sumer, Egypt, and the first cities of the Indus Valley, all between 4000 and 3000 BC. One event, multiple civilizations. That was the argument. And it is an argument that the archaeology of the last 20 years has not destroyed. It has refined it, complicated it, added nuances, but not destroyed. Because the trail of refugees is there. In the sediments, yes, but also in something much harder to dispute, in stone, in clay, in settlement patterns that show populations appearing in regions where they previously did not exist, shortly after 5600 BC, coming from a specific direction. From the north, from the Black Sea region. There is a pattern in archaeology that researchers call the refugee signature. It is not an official term. It does not appear in methodology manuals, but any archaeologist working with prehistoric migrations recognizes the concept immediately. It is the set of markers that appear at a new site brought by populations that arrived from elsewhere, which do not belong to the local cultural tradition, and which appear abruptly in the stratigraphic record without regional precedent. Pottery with patterns that did not previously exist in that area. Agricultural techniques that appear suddenly without a local development stage. Breeds of domesticated animals that are not native to the region. Architectural structures with a different orientation and proportion than local traditions. Each of these elements, isolated, can have multiple explanations. Together, in the same stratigraphic layer, dated to the same period, they point to a single explanation. Someone arrived from the outside, and they arrived in sufficient numbers to change the culture of the place where they settled. After 5600 BC, this signature appears in places that have no obvious connection to each other. In Bulgaria and Romania, the archaeological sites of the Hamangia culture, which flourished on the shores of the Black Sea and the lower Danube, show an abrupt collapse followed by a cultural reconfiguration. Romanian researchers from the Romanian Academy of Sciences documented in excavations carried out in the 2010s and 20 a rupture in the ceramic record that coincides with the flood period calculated by Ryan and Pitman. The Hamangia culture villages that existed at low elevations, close to the Black Sea margin, are abandoned. New communities appear on higher grounds with hybrid characteristics, a mixture of the local tradition with elements that suggest contact with populations coming from the east. From the direction of the Black Sea. In Anatolia, the same rupture appears. The sites of the Neolithic tradition that had flourished for millennia on the northern coast of Turkey show a layer of abandonment dated to approximately 5600 BC. And then, in the more internal plains of Anatolia and on the slopes of the Taurus Mountains, new settlements appear, smaller, more dispersed, but with cultural continuity that clearly links the inhabitants to the previous coastal traditions. People who knew the sea, who fled to the mountains, and who never again built near the water. This is the archaeological detail that Walter Pitman recorded, and that rarely receives the attention it deserves. The settlements founded by populations that migrated from the Black Sea region after approximately 5600 BC were rarely built below 45 meters in altitude. In some cases, the minimum settlement elevation rises to 60-70 meters above current sea level. It was not a topographical coincidence, not an aesthetic preference. It was an unwritten rule passed from generation to generation by people who had seen, or whose parents had seen, what water was capable of doing. This was not an accident. It was traumatic memory encoded in territorial behavior. And here is where linguistics enters, and where the story gets denser than most people expect. Proto-Indo-European is the hypothetical ancestral language from which derive, among others, Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, English, Russian, Hindi, and Spanish. There is no written text in Proto-Indo-European because it was spoken before the invention of writing, but linguists managed to reconstruct words and structures of this original language by systematic comparison of descendant languages in a method called comparative reconstruction. And what this reconstruction reveals about the Proto-Indo-European vocabulary is fascinating. There is a reconstructed word for water that is at the root of dozens of Indo-European languages. There is a word for flood that appears in multiple independent branches of the linguistic family. There is a word for catastrophic flood that linguists identify as part of the primitive vocabulary of the language. Not a later addition, but a word that was there from the beginning. Bill Darden, a linguist at the University of Chicago specialized in Proto-Indo-European reconstruction, estimated that the fragmentation of Indo-European languages from the Common Trunk occurred around 3500 BC, approximately 2,000 years after the Black Sea flood. This means that the migratory impulse of the event may not have immediately fractionated the languages. On the contrary, it suggests that the dispersed populations maintained enough cultural contact for centuries to preserve a common language, and that linguistic fragmentation was the result of a gradual and increasing dispersal over generations, not an instantaneous explosion. But the memory of the flood traveled with these languages. Stop. Think about that for a moment. If the Black Sea refugees carried their language for 2,000 years while dispersing through the ancient world, they also carried their stories, their founding myths, their accounts of what happened. The event that destroyed their original homeland, the flood that came from the south, that covered everything, that did not stop, was the central narrative of the collective identity of these people. It was the story that grandparents told grandchildren around the fire. It was the explanation for why they lived where they lived and no longer closer to the water. It was the reason why altitude had sacred meaning in their cultures. And when some of these groups reached Mesopotamia, to the fertile plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the land was flat and irrigated and conducive to large-scale agriculture, they carried this memory with them. The Sumerians, who founded the first city-states in the world between 4000 and 3000 BC, developed an extraordinarily rich oral and later written tradition of flood narratives. The Sumerian flood does not appear only in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It appears before it, on a clay tablet found at Nippur, written in Sumerian, which scholars call the Eridu Genesis. On this tablet, dated to approximately 1700 BC, but based on a much older oral tradition, a priest-king named Ziusudra receives warning from the gods of an imminent flood and builds a vessel to survive. Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, Noah. 4 versions of the same story, 4 different languages, 4 different civilizations, 4,000 years of oral transmission before any of them were written. The question that researchers ask, and that Ryan and Pitman answer directly in the 1998 book, is: what is the probability that 4 independent civilizations, without proven contact with each other, separately invented the same story about a catastrophic flood? A hero who builds a vessel, saved animals, and the renewal of the world after the flood. The statistical answer is close to 0. In 1872, a British museum employee named George Smith was cataloguing clay tablet fragments that had been excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in Mesopotamia by archaeologist Austin Henry Layard 2 decades earlier. The tablets came from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, destroyed when Nineveh was sacked by the Babylonians and Medes in 612 BC. They were fragments of baked clay, covered in cuneiform characters, numbered and catalogued, without anyone yet knowing what they contained. Smith began to translate, and at a certain point, he stopped. The text he was reading described a flood. A man warned by the gods, a vessel built in haste to carry animals and family, water covering the world, a bird sent to check if dry land had reappeared, the bird returning without having found where to perch. Smith was so agitated that, according to accounts of colleagues present in the room that day, he got up from his chair and began to walk in circles. It was the story of Noah, but written in Assyrian cuneiform, centuries before any accepted date for the composition of Genesis. The text was the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest epic poem in world literature. The Assyrian text that Smith translated dates to approximately 700 BC, but scholars have identified earlier versions in Old Babylonian, dated to approximately 1700 BC, and even older fragments in Sumerian dating back to approximately 2100 BC. Each version is older than the previous one, and each version tells the same story in its core: a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A single man chosen to survive, a vessel loaded with animals, water covering the mountains. The hero of the flood in the Akkadian version of the epic is called Utnapishtim. In the older Babylonian version, the name is Atrahasis. In the Sumerian version of the Nippur tablet, it is Ziusudra. 3 names, 3 different languages of the same Mesopotamian linguistic family. A single story at the core. And here is the data that most people do not know. Scholar Irving Finkel, curator of the British Museum's Middle East Department and one of the greatest living experts in cuneiform, published in 2014 the book The Ark Before Noah, based on a clay tablet, the Ark tablet, that a private collector had brought to the museum decades earlier without understanding what he had. The tablet, dated to approximately 1900 BC, contained detailed instructions for building the Babylonian flood ark. It was not a narrative, it was a technical engineering specification. Dimensions, materials, bitumen waterproofing method, load capacity. Finkel identified that the ark described was circular, a giant coracle, the traditional boat type of Mesopotamian rivers, with 65 meters in diameter and 3.5 meter high walls. The precision of the instructions, Finkel argued, suggested that the text derived from a much older oral tradition that preserved real technical details, not invented, but transmitted from generations that had concrete reason to build an emergency vessel in response to a real flood. The Ark tablet was displayed at the British Museum in 2014 and generated global coverage. The Telegraph, The Guardian, The New York Times, they all covered it. Finkel was careful in his public statements. He did not claim that the Sumerian flood and the biblical flood were the same event. He stated that both derived from a common oral tradition, and that this oral tradition preserved memories of real floods that occurred in Mesopotamia or adjacent regions. But Ryan and Pitman went further than Finkel. In the 1998 book, they argued that the transmission chain was geographically traceable. The Black Sea refugees who reached Mesopotamia after 5600 BC were Neolithic farmers with a collective memory of a flood of unprecedented scale. They were not illiterate in the sense of being culturally primitive. They were sophisticated enough to build permanent villages, domesticate animals, and grow cereals. When they reached Mesopotamia and found the fertile environment of the valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, they integrated with the local populations over generations. And the memory of the flood they brought was gradually fused with the already existing Mesopotamian oral traditions. The result was Utnapishtim. It was Atrahasis. It was Ziusudra. And then, centuries later, when the Mesopotamian texts came to the knowledge of the Hebrew traditions, whether by direct contact during the Babylonian captivity of Israel in the 6th century BC, or by much older oral transmission through the Near Eastern trade routes, the story was retold once more, with a new name for the hero, with a monotheistic rather than polytheistic theology, with a moral emphasis that the Sumerian and Babylonian texts did not have: Noah. And here is the geographical connection that closes the argument with a precision that is hard to ignore. The text of Genesis 8, verse 4, locates the resting place of the Ark on Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat is located on the border between Turkey and Armenia in eastern Anatolia. Its maximum altitude is 5,137 meters, the highest mountain in Turkey. From the base of Mount Ararat, the distance to the northeastern coast of Turkey, the region of Sinop, where Ballard found the submerged structures, is approximately 450 kilometers in a straight line. 450 kilometers, the distance that a group of refugees on foot with animals could cover in weeks or months of marching. Can you imagine that? Entire families marching inland toward the mountains, looking back while the water advanced over everything they knew. And the highest mountain they could see on the horizon, the safest point in the world at that moment, was Ararat. Let's put everything on the table at once. Not as theory, not as speculation, as a sequence of verifiable facts, each with a source, each with a date, each with the name of the researcher or institution that documented it. Because it is exactly here, at this point in the video, that the sum of the parts becomes greater than each separate part. And when you see the complete sequence all at once without interruption, the weight of what it implies is different from anything you have read or heard on this subject before. Fact 1. Around 5,600 BC, a plain inhabited by sedentary Neolithic communities was submerged by a catastrophic flood in the Black Sea. This fact is recorded physically in the sediment cores analyzed by William Ryan and Walter Pitman of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, published in the journal Marine Geology in 1998. The shell hash layer, abruptly crushed freshwater mollusk shells, is the physical record of a sudden mass death of an entire fauna. It is not interpretation. It is sedimentary chemistry. Fact 2. In September of the year 2000, Robert Ballard found worked wooden structures, stone tools, and building materials at 95 meters deep on the northern coast of Turkey, near Sinop. The carbon-14 dating of the freshwater mollusks found at the same stratigraphic level as the structures confirmed an age greater than 7,000 years. Columbia University issued an official statement. The find was published in the American Journal of Archaeology in 2001. The structures exist. They were filmed. They are documented. Fact 3. The anoxic waters of the Black Sea floor preserve organic material for millennia without decomposition. The 2,400-year-old Greek ship found intact by Black Sea map in 2018, with mast raised, sail folded, oars in place, is direct physical proof of this preservation capacity, documented by the University of Southampton and published with global coverage in October 2018. If a 2,400-year-old ship is intact, 7,000-year-old structures in anoxic sediment may be in a state of preservation that defies any expectation. Fact 4. The dispersal of Neolithic populations from the Black Sea region after 5,600 BC is documented archaeologically in multiple regions simultaneously: Bulgaria, Romania, Anatolia, Mesopotamian plains. The cultural signature of these populations appears at sites that previously did not have a dense, sedentary agricultural tradition. The settlements founded by these populations systematically avoid elevations below 45 meters, a pattern identified by Pitman as traumatic memory encoded in territorial behavior. Fact 5. The flood narrative appears in 4 independent traditions of the Near East and Mesopotamia: Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Hebrew, with identical structural elements: divine warning, vessel construction, animal rescue, total flood, mountain rest, birds sent to check the receding waters. The oldest identified version, the Sumerian Nippur tablet known as Eridu Genesis, dates to approximately 1,700 BC, but is based on an oral tradition that scholars estimate to be much older. Irving Finkel of the British Museum documented in 2014 that the tradition preserved technical shipbuilding details that suggest memory of a real event, not an invented allegory. Fact 6. Mount Ararat, where the Genesis text locates the resting place of Noah's Ark, is 450 kilometers in a straight line from the Sinop coast, where Ballard found the submerged structures. It is in eastern Anatolia, exactly in the direction that refugees from the northern coast of Turkey would take when fleeing inland toward the highest point visible on the horizon. 6 facts, 6 independent sources, all pointing in the same direction. Stop. Think about that for a moment. The question that Ryan and Pitman posed, and which was never refuted, only qualified, is this. What is more likely? That 4 independent civilizations without proven contact with each other separately invented the same story of a global flood with the same structural elements, or that all these civilizations received the memory of a real event, transmitted by populations who lived through it, who dispersed through the ancient world, carrying that memory as a central part of their identity? The answer is not religious. It is statistical, it is archaeological, it is geological, and it is here that Noah ceases to be just an Old Testament character and becomes something more concrete and more disturbing than any theological interpretation could capture. Noah may have been a real person, or he may have been the name that the Hebrew oral tradition gave to a collective archetype, the survivor, the father who saved his family, the man who looked back and saw his homeland disappear underwater, and who spent the rest of his life building on high ground, never again near the sea, never again below 45 meters of altitude. But there is an element of the Genesis text that is rarely discussed in this context, and which, when you see it in the light of what Ryan, Pitman and Ballard discovered, acquires a different weight. Genesis 6, verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. The text does not describe the flood as a random climatic phenomenon. It describes it as a response to a human condition, a civilization that had grown beyond some limit, that had built something that needed to be erased and started over. Theological tradition has always interpreted this verse in the moral and spiritual sense. But what if the collective memory preserved in the text also held, in sacred language, the memory of a real demographic reality? A fertile, habitable plain with a mild climate and abundant water that had sustained sedentary communities for centuries. Communities that grew, that became dense, that built permanent villages, then embryonic cities, then trade networks between settlements. A Neolithic civilization that reached in the Black Sea region a level of complexity that archaeologists like those who studied the Cucuteni Tripilia culture documented as surprisingly sophisticated for the period, and which was erased in less than a year, not by war, not by disease, by water. The final paradox is this: the Bible describes the flood as the end of one world and the beginning of another. And that is exactly what the geological, archaeological, and linguistic data suggest happened. The world that existed in the Black Sea plain before 5600 BC ended. The survivors who reached Mesopotamia, Egypt, Central Europe, and the Indus Plains founded a new world, with the seeds, animals, agricultural techniques, and traumatic memory they brought with them. This new world is what we call Western civilization. We are the cultural descendants of the Black Sea flood survivors, not in the exclusive genetic sense. Human populations are too complex for linear reductions, but in the cultural and technological sense, large-scale agriculture, domesticated animal husbandry, permanent architecture, sedentary social organization. All these characteristics that define civilization as we know it reached Mesopotamia, Egypt and Europe, with the populations that dispersed after the flood. And the memory of the event that triggered this dispersal survived for 4,000 years of oral tradition before being written. In Hebrew, in Sumerian clay, in Assyrian cuneiform, in Egyptian papyrus. Always the same story: the water that came, the man who survived, the world that started over. There is something at 90 meters deep at the bottom of the Black Sea that can prove this definitively, or that can complicate the narrative in ways we cannot yet predict. And the current state of science regarding this possibility is more surprising and more urgent than anything we have discussed so far. In 2023, a group of researchers from Ankara University and the Institute of Marine Sciences of Turkey published a high-resolution bathymetric survey of the Sinop underwater shelf, the same region where Ballard worked in 2000. They used latest generation multibeam sonar, the type of equipment that maps the bottom relief with a resolution of less than 1 meter, capable of distinguishing a stone wall from a natural rock formation at 100 meters deep. The survey identified anomalies on the seafloor in multiple points of the shelf, elevations and depressions in the sediment that do not correspond to natural geological patterns. Anomalies, not confirmed structures. Anomalies. This distinction matters. In the language of underwater archaeology, anomaly is the technical term for any deviation from the expected geological pattern that may indicate human intervention. But that needs direct investigation to be confirmed or discarded. It is the underwater equivalent of what terrestrial archaeologists detect with ground-penetrating radar before starting to excavate. A sign that something different is down there, without yet knowing what. The Ankara survey was not widely publicized outside Turkish academic circles. It did not make headlines, but it is there, published, with coordinates with raw data available to any team that wants to take the next step. And the next step was never taken. This is what Black Sea underwater archaeology seems to do systematically. Advance to the edge of the definitive answer and then stop for reasons that have less to do with science and more to do with money, politics, and the logistical difficulty of working in an environment that punishes any imprecision with the immediate and irreversible loss of extremely valuable equipment. Let's be concrete about what would be necessary to excavate the Sinop site in an archaeologically rigorous way. An underwater excavation at 95 meters deep requires archaeological precision ROVs, not the exploration vehicles Ballard used in 2000, which were sufficient for filming and collecting superficial samples, but vehicles equipped with manipulator arms capable of removing sediment in controlled millimeter layers without disturbing the stratigraphic context of the artifacts. There are today, in 2026, perhaps 4 or 5 pieces of equipment in the world with this technical specification. All are in use by research consortia with decades-long agendas. The cost of an excavation season under these conditions, considering support ship charter, operation of precision ROVs, an onboard conservation lab to immediately treat organic artifacts that are extremely vulnerable when exposed to oxygen after millennia in an anoxic environment, a team of archaeologists, geologists and conservators, and the negotiation of licenses with Turkish authorities easily exceeds $20 million per season. And a proper excavation would require not 1 season, it would require a decade. Here is where the story gets disturbing in a different way, not by the magnitude of what may be there, but by the magnitude of what we are choosing not to investigate. Because the bottom of the Black Sea is not only preserving houses, it is potentially preserving the most complete record of a prehistoric civilization that has ever been found. Not scattered fragments in layers of earth that centuries of agriculture and construction disturbed. Not pottery broken in patterns that need to be reconstituted, but an intact site, frozen at the moment of abandonment with the original spatial logic intact, tools where they were left, structures with their original proportions, organic sediment that may contain pollen, seeds, animal bones, and possibly human remains. The Black Sea map, with all its reach, focused on shipwrecks because shipwrecks are discrete objects with clear limits, easier to map and document in short-duration campaigns. The archaeology of human occupation of the underwater shelf, the type of work Ballard began in 2000, stayed in the background. Professor John Adams, leader of the Black Sea map, recognized in interviews subsequent to the project that the archaeology of the shallow shelf represented a frontier that the project had not systematically crossed, and that it represented perhaps the greatest unexplored archaeological potential of the Mediterranean and Black Sea combined. But there is a recent development that changed the calculation of what is technically possible. In 2022, the underwater technology company Ocean Infinity, the same one that had carried out searches for the MH370 plane missing in the Indian Ocean, announced the development of fleets of autonomous underwater vehicles capable of operating in parallel, mapping extensive areas with archaeological resolution in fractions of the time conventional expeditions would take. It is not science fiction. It is operational technology that has already been used in deep water search campaigns with documented results. Applied to the Sinop shelf, a fleet of autonomous vehicles of this generation could map hundreds of square kilometers of seafloor with sufficient resolution to identify structures in weeks at a cost that would be prohibitive 10 years ago, but today begins to enter the reach of large research projects with mixed public and private funding. The obstacle is no longer technological. It is political and financial, and perhaps a matter of collective priority, of deciding that what is at the bottom of the Black Sea deserves the level of attention and resource we dedicate to other archaeological projects that generate fewer potential revelations. Leave in the comments what you think. Should the world fund a complete excavation of the bottom of the Black Sea? Because the argument for this excavation is not only archaeological, it is civilizational. What is buried on the Sinop underwater shelf is not just a Neolithic village, it is potentially the missing link between the geological event Ryan and Pitman documented and the cultural memory that survived for 4,000 years and ended up written in the text of Genesis. It is the physical proof, or the refutation, of the hypothesis that connects the Black Sea flood to Noah's flood. It is the answer to the question George Smith involuntarily asked when he got up from his chair in 1872 at the British Museum. Where did this story come from? And there is an aspect of this issue that has not yet been fully understood, neither by science nor by the public, about what an excavation would reveal, not only in archaeological terms, but in terms of what it means for the history of human faith. Because if Ballard structures are confirmed as part of a settlement inhabited before the flood, and if the dating and geographical location continue to point to the same convergence that Ryan and Pitman identified, then the text of Genesis is not what skeptics say it is, an allegory invented by Hebrew writers to transmit moral truths in narrative language. It is an archive, imperfect, transmitted through millennia of oral retellings, reinterpreted in every culture that received it, enriched with theology and meaning in each successive version, but at the core, an archive of something that happened, that was lived, that left marks in the sediment and marks in human memory with the same permanence and the same precision. The water arrived, the houses sank, the people fled, and someone survived to tell. Step back for a moment, not to the beginning of this video, to much earlier. Step back to a morning approximately 5,600 years before Christ. A village in the northern plain of Anatolia, on the shores of a freshwater lake that its inhabitants had known since birth, which their grandparents knew, which their great-grandparents knew, which was there before any living memory. The morning begins like all others. The cattle wake up, the hearths are lit, the children leave the structures of wood and clay into the cold air of dawn. And at some point that morning, someone looks south and sees something different on the horizon. It is not a storm, it is not smoke, it is a shimmer where there should be no shimmer, the sun's reflection on a water surface that advanced during the night over land that yesterday was dry. The person who sees this has no words for what they are seeing. They have no maps, they have no radio, they have no way of knowing that 800 kilometers from there, at the narrowest point between two continents, a barrier of brittle rock gave way under the pressure of an entire ocean, and that 42 cubic kilometers of salt water are pouring in per day into a lake that has no outlet. All that person knows is that the water is closer than it was yesterday, and that it is coming. Think about the weight of this moment. Not as historical abstraction, as concrete human experience. You built that house. You know every wooden beam, every interwoven branch in the walls, every stone of the hearth. You planted the cereals growing in the fields to the south. You have tools your father made, that your father's father used. You have children who were born on that floor under that roof. And now you have to decide, in hours, not in days, what you carry and what you abandon forever. The stone tools Ballard filmed at 95 meters deep in 2000 were left by someone who made that choice. They were not thrown away. They were not forgotten through carelessness. They were left because there was no room, or because they were too heavy, or because the water was arriving too fast. They are the physical trail of a decision taken in panic or in pain by a real person who existed, who breathed, who loved that place, and who never returned. 7,000 years later, an ROV with video cameras illuminated those tools with artificial light at the bottom of the sea and transmitted them to a monitor on a ship 95 meters above, where Robert Ballard saw them for the first time. And Ballard, the man who had found the Titanic, the Bismarck, the Yorktown, who had seen more historical destruction preserved on the sea floor than any living person, immediately recognized what he was seeing. It was not abstract archaeology. It was the exact point where human history and geological catastrophe touch. And that point is 12 miles from the Turkish coast, at 95 meters deep, on a sea floor that preserves organic wood for millennia without decomposition, on a site that has never been completely excavated, in a region where recent bathymetric surveys identified multiple anomalies that no archaeological team has yet systematically investigated. The paradox that defines all this is this: the catastrophe that destroyed that civilization created the conditions for the proofs of its existence to survive better than any human museum could guarantee. The same salt water that covered the houses, that killed the lake, that forced the flight of entire generations. That water created the anoxic zone that frozen time at 90 meters deep, which preserved a 2,400-year-old Greek ship with its mast raised, which may have preserved, in a state of integrity impossible anywhere else on the planet, the complete physical record of a village abandoned in haste on a morning in 5600 BC. And the memory of this event, transmitted by survivors who fled to the mountains, who founded new villages on high grounds, who taught their children never to build near the water, that memory crossed 4,000 years of oral tradition, passed through Sumerians and Babylonians and Assyrians, reached the Hebrews, and was written in Genesis with the name of a single man who represents them all. Noah, the survivor, the father who saved his family, the man who built on high ground and never again came down. This is not metaphor. It is memory. It is the longest and best preserved archive in human history, preserved simultaneously in geological sediment at 90 meters deep and in sacred text 4,000 years ago. There is a question that this subject inevitably poses to anyone who has made it this far. If Noah's flood derived from a real event, if Genesis preserved in sacred language the collective memory of a catastrophe that happened, that was lived by real people, that left verifiable physical marks at the bottom of the Black Sea, what does that do to faith? The answer depends entirely on how you understand the relationship between the sacred and the real. There is a tradition ranging from Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century AD to contemporary theologians at Oxford University, which argues that the truth of a sacred text does not depend on its historical literality, but on what it reveals about the human condition and about the relationship between the human and the divine. From this perspective, Discovering that Noah's flood has roots in a real geological event does not diminish the text. It enriches it. It transforms an allegory into something denser, the proof that the human experience of catastrophe, survival, and new beginnings is so universal and so old that it crossed millennia of oral transmission and arrived intact in multiple independent traditions. But there is another layer to this reflection that is more direct. The Bible is not a geology book. It was not written to describe limestone rock erosion mechanisms or hydrological flow rates. It was written to preserve the memory of a fundamental human experience, the experience of losing everything, of surviving against the odds, of rebuilding from scratch, of finding meaning in chaos. And what Ryan, Pitman and Ballard discovered, working with sediment and underwater cameras and carbon-14 dating, is that this experience was not invented. It was lived by real people in a real place, which still exists, submerged, verifiable, at 90 meters deep. This does not resolve the theological debate, but it places that debate on different ground, more solid, more honest. The question is no longer, did Noah's flood happen? The question is, what do we do with the fact that the memory of a real catastrophe survived 4,000 years of oral transmission and reached us in the form of a sacred text? And that the physical proofs of this event are intact at the bottom of the Black Sea, waiting to be completely excavated? That question has no easy answer, and that is exactly why it matters. If this video made you think differently about what the Bible is, not just as a religious document, but as an archive of the oldest human memory, leave it in the comments. Do you think science brings faith closer or pushes it further away when it finds real evidence behind sacred texts? I want to read what you think. And if the story of what is at the bottom of the Black Sea disturbed you in the right way, the next video will disturb you even more, because the same type of investigation that connected Noah to the Black Sea was applied to another Old Testament text. And what the archaeologists found this time was not underwater, it was under the sand.